الشباب الشغالين في التكايا وغرف الطوارئ حتلقاهم اصلا هم كانوا يعني الثوار كانوا في ثورة ديسمبر.
كان نظام العينة في القوات المسلحة إعلان حالة الطوارئ في جميع أنحاء البلاد.
كنا كشباب قاعدين وكنا بنلاحظ انه العربات بينقلوا الناس من مناطق بتاعة النزاع، فيو قمنا بتقويم بتاعة الغرفة الطوارئ يعني انه حسب استوعب هنا بقول لك انه 8 ولا 9 نفر.
عيش لي صفيحة يا أخ طماطم قاعد منح. يا ساتر كمان مشاكل بنكك دي الشبكة ما عارف تفتح ما عارف.
بعد إيقاف USAID حتى الغرف عموما غير الغرف النسوية حتأثر جدا.
فجأة يجيك ذخيرة نازل في السرير إنك أنت قاعدة ولا قاعد في كرسي، إنه نحن نكون بين اتجاهين مسلحين.
ماشيين وين؟
بعد ده خلاص نرجع المطبخ ثاني نمشي نداوم في المطبخ المركزي بتاع الغرفة.
التطوع هو أداة أو وسيلة من وسائل الاحتياج.
الاغتصاب ده كان لشنو؟ عملوا لشنو؟ بيستخدموه كسلاح ضد الناس اللي قاعدين ديل. أنا ما بس بقتلك ببندقية.
يدك ماله؟
الطلقة غشت بجاي وطلعت بجاي الأضم ده اتكسر من النص، وزوجي ذاته يا هو مضروب بيدانة في راسه، العين الواحدة اتقدت والعين الثانية أسي برضه ما قاعد يشوف يعني أعمى أسي.
فنحن في ظل التطوع فقدنا كمية من الشباب والشابات المبادرات، فكان أول متطوع إنه نحن فقدناها ساجدة عبد المولى، فهي كانت عبارة عن الأخت والصديقة.
I have to say, if you want inspiration, I don't know anything more inspirational than the ERRs, the emergency relief rooms, and the people who run them. And the fact that they didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, it went to that Venezuelan woman who gave it to Donald Trump. Okay, maybe next year. Right, we have a great panel here. I'm going to go from the end to the end. Rosalind Marsden was once our ambassador in Sudan. That was, I think, when I first met you, and now works on Sudan for Chatham House and is really one of the people who works hardest on Sudan and in terms of information and making sure that those who care know what's going on. Eva Khaya is a British Sudanese medical doctor, and you run so many different organisations, but I think the one I'm going to mention is the Sudan Transnational Consortium, because you're bringing together Sudanese professionals, right, who are working in the diaspora and in Sudan. And then Kate Ferguson, who's a late addition, and we're very grateful to you, Kate, for coming, who's the co-CEO of Protection Approaches. And I'm told that what she does, because I don't think we've met before, is atrocity prevention. Oh, we could do with some of that, couldn't we? Preventing atrocities. So the situation is at the moment, I think many of you will know that El Fasher in Darfur was overrun by the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, in December, and that was it was terrible, the atrocities, and it's still coming out what happened there. And now the battlefield has really moved to Kordofan, which is between El Fasher and Khartoum, where the Sudan Armed Forces, the SAF, who call themselves the government, you can call them the government, some people wouldn't say that was right, are. So we're seeing a spreading or a moving war. So I wonder, Rosalind, if you can just give us a bit of a picture of what's happening on the battlefield now and what you are most concerned about.
Sure, thank you very much. Well, good evening, everyone. I think on the battlefield, we're sadly still seeing the conflict escalating. After the appalling atrocities in Al Fasher, the RSF have continued to increase their sort of offensive. They moved eastwards and captured most of West Kordofan state, and now the epicenter of the fighting is going on in the Kordofans as the RSF attempt to, the RSF and their ally, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement led by Abdulaziz al-Hilu, who for many years has controlled an autonomous area in the Nuba Mountains. He, last February, teamed up with the RSF, and they are at the moment jointly trying to besiege and to capture the two main towns in South Kordofan, Dillinj and Kadugli. The Rapid Support Force is also aiming to see if it can besiege and capture El Abeid, which is a major trade hub, with a view to trying to move forward towards Omdurman and Khartoum again. And then just recently, there's also been a new battlefront opened up in Blue Nile state, which is bordered by Ethiopia and South Sudan. So, and of course, both sides are increasing their use of advanced drones to conduct both targeted and indiscriminate aerial attacks, many of which are hitting civilian areas, markets, hospitals, schools, and so forth.
Can I just stop you there, because I'm going to come back to you to talk about who's arming and supporting the two groups, but I would like to move to Eva now. So Eva, Rosalind has painted us this picture of what's happening on the battlefield. Can you talk us a bit about the humanitarian situation and what you see as the most important humanitarian challenges at this time?
Of course, thank you so much. It's great to be back. Indeed, thank you, Ros. I think when it comes to the scale of the humanitarian situation in Sudan, people really refer to it in all of these superlatives, right? The biggest, the worst, and so on. And it's interesting that, when you note that Sudan's humanitarian crisis is the worst since records began. But not only is it the worst humanitarian crisis, it's the largest in terms of numbers. Also largest displacement crisis, largest protection crisis, largest hunger crisis. And that's really sobering and devastating, given that Sudan was once known as the breadbasket of the world. It's incredible. But I think one of the humanitarian challenges that we're seeing is, this sort of jigsaw puzzle of armed actors. Sudan is a jigsaw puzzle. The territories are owned by, the sort of de facto regime of the day. Certainly, I wouldn't use the word government personally. But essentially, that makes aid access very difficult for the formal aid sector. But we do have this incredible phenomenon of mutual aid groups that are keeping the country alive. And they're not really seeing any as much funding as we would like to see. The ERRs have latterly been recognized and started to be funded by the UK government, which is certainly a win, but they can't shoulder it alone. And we have the health sector, the education sector in ruins, over 30 million in need of humanitarian assistance, 12 million displaced. These are incredible numbers, incredible shifts. And not only is the international response not keeping up, the humanitarian appeal, UN appeal is 28% funded, something like that. You know, Ukraine gets funded on the day every year. It's really quite incredible, the sort of neglect, but there's also a sort of political paralysis when it comes to dealing with Sudan. And that means that every now and then you get some humanitarian pledges that stay locked up in banks because nobody can access certain areas to use that funding. And there really needs to be a reimagination of how we do aid that doesn't just require formal actors. And I'd say the number one humanitarian issue right now is the political crisis. This humanitarian situation is not the result of a flood or fire or volcano. It is the result of a political crisis, political decisions, which are being made every day. So we need humanitarian aid, but we need political solutions.
Okay, let me bring Kate in at this point, because that's a really important point. We're not talking about, you know, a typhoon or an earthquake. We're talking about what men do, and it is mainly men. So tell us a little bit from your perspective, atrocity prevention, you know, you're looking at that side of it. What do we do?
Yeah, I mean, it's so good to be with all of you and be with such dear friends, colleagues, because we don't get enough chance, I don't think, to talk about Sudan and what's taking place in the whole. And I think there are three vectors of desperate crisis taking place in Sudan now. One is an armed conflict, and that is primarily characterized by two sets of warring groups and parties, and there's networks, and kind of we can go into those devolved structures. And there is an armed conflict going on. But related to that armed conflict is efforts to deliberately target civilians, to deliberately target, either to destroy them as groups or to forcibly displace them based on a real or perceived aspect of their identity, whether that is racial, whether that is religious, whether that is actually political. And you know, I do a lot of work with many on this panel in the room, particularly around the atrocities that take place by the RSF in Darfur, in the Kordofans, where you see this as political strategy. And that's where you see then this coming together of this desperate humanitarian situation, which is not incidental, it is intentionally engineered as a tool, both of warfare and of civilian destruction. And so that's the work that we do, is that we are really trying to look at, well, what does it mean to center the Sudanese civilian, not the elite men who are in fact engaged in this political and military and financial battle, but they are also targeting civilians not as a byproduct, not as a side piece or a unintentional consequence. They are deliberately targeting whole groups of people because that is what their political objectives, as well as their military and their economic objectives, require. And so one of the big problems that I think, you know, I hope we get a chance to talk about here is, yes, we need a ceasefire. Of course we need a ceasefire. Ceasefires actually don't always end immediately the suffering of civilians. We can see in the West Bank that while a ceasefire for Gaza has brought very uneasy a halting of some forms of violence against that civilian population, it has in fact not led to a quietening down of deliberate targeting and destruction of Palestinians in the West Bank. So yes, we need an end to the war, but why is there not, alongside those efforts to end that armed conflict, and why alongside efforts to raise financial aid for the humanitarian situation, are we not absolutely charging ahead with efforts to find ways to protect people who are being targeted? I would use the language of crimes against humanity and genocide. Use non-legal language if that makes you feel more comfortable if you're a policymaker. Whether it's identity-based violence, whether it is efforts to destroy and displace, civilians are being targeted. And at the moment, that political challenge to try and look at why they are being assaulted, why they're being forcibly removed, why they are being massacred, is falling between the cracks of the efforts towards a ceasefire and the provision of humanitarian aid.
Okay, well, let me bring Rosalind in here, because I think that this is an important moment to talk about the regional actors who are supporting the different sides. So we see the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, which it denies it, but there is plenty evidence, is arming and supporting the rapid support forces. And on the other side, the south, we have Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And one of the things which is really one of the developments, which I think is very interesting, is that this has been sort of rumbling along, but actually over something that happened in Yemen, which we won't go into, the Saudis and the UAE have really fallen out in recent weeks. And this is very interesting. There is a real split, and Sudan is in the center of the split. And what I don't know is whether this is good or bad. Because I don't know if it's a bad thing, it means that everybody's going to start supporting their side more, or whether it means that they are actually, that it means that they're going to actually pull back. So, Rosalind, can you tell us a little bit about Saudi Arabia and the UAE, their support for the two sides, and how that should be dealt with?
Sure, of course, thank you. And in addition to the domestic dimensions of the war, which I hope we'll have a chance to talk about because they're very important, I mean, the war is increasingly becoming a regional war with countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, but also Turkey, Qatar, Iran, and Russia and others fueling the war in pursuit of their own security, economic, or geopolitical interests. The Sudan war has become increasingly entangled with broader regional rivalries and tensions, including growing tensions between Ethiopia and Eritrea, the UAE-Saudi rivalry over gaining more influence in the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa, Egyptian-Ethiopian tensions over the Nile waters and the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and Israeli recognition of Somaliland. All these developments have contributed to the consolidation of different regional axes aligned with the opposing sides in Sudan's war. And how long the war will continue will crucially depend on whether the belligerents can continue to obtain advanced weapons from their external backers. There have been multiple reports by investigative journalists, researchers, and the UN panel of experts, which suggest that the UAE has facilitated military supplies for the Rapid Support Force, although this continues to be vehemently denied by UAE officials. While the Sudanese army, on the other hand, has reportedly received drones from Turkey and Iran and military, logistical, and financial support from other regional allies. There are also rumours, not verified, I think, of a forthcoming big arms deal from Pakistan. So far from external support diminishing, there's been a consolidation of regional axes aligned with Sudan's conflict parties. And there is now growing concern that the intensification of the Saudi Emirati rift, particularly after recent dramatic developments in Yemen, when Saudi aeroplanes struck UAE-backed militias in Hadramaut province, resulting in the dissolution of the Southern Transitional Council and then the withdrawal of the UAE, that all these developments could impact on Sudan. And in fact,
but how could they?
Already
tell us how do they impact on Sudan?
Well, I think what the signs we're now seeing, first of all, a consolidation recently of a pro-South Saudi, Egyptian, Turkish alliance which in support of the South, which also has wider links to Eritrea, Algeria, Djibouti, and Western Libya. Saudi Arabia, alongside Turkey and Egypt, has reportedly been stepping up support for the army in an attempt to counteract UAE's support for the RSF, with signs of a more assertive Saudi strategy in Sudan. Initially, it very much tried to appear neutral, even if there was a sort of tacit leaning towards the army. And this has included the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman going to Washington and asking President Trump to intervene during his White House visit, and establishing a high-level coordination committee with Saudi Arabia.
Can
And there
I
have
stop
also
you there? Because
been-
I just want to stop
Yes.
you there because this is a lot of detail. It's a lot to take in. So, Ava, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing if a lot more weapons go to the SAF, because they're both awful, but the SAF is arguably slightly less horrible than the RSF, and maybe it's better if that side wins.
Playing devil's advocate, I see.
No, I'm
Lindsay.
putting forward
course.
quite a pragmatic solution. I've seen a lot of wars in this world, and sometimes it's better if somebody wins, even if they're not very nice.
Sure, right. Well, okay, where do I start? So when it comes to the SAF and the RSF, the first thing we have to remember is that the RSF came from the SAF machinery. This is a two-headed cobra, and this is, or a two-sided coin, pick your metaphor. Essentially, you know, there is nothing to say that what the RSF is doing does not have its origins in...
I'm not talking about origins, I'm talking about now. I'm not talking about Darfur and the genocide there in 2003. I'm talking about how we deal with what is happening now.
So essentially, the SAF wants an all-out win, right? As does the RSF. And who wins does depend on the external backers, which is why what Ros was saying is so crucial. And this is where how, you know, the pressure is applied diplomatically matters, and whose friends, you know, make phone calls to whom. The problem with giving the SAF a win, and we've been challenged about this on the Hill in DC, we've been challenged about this in, you know, roundabout words and roundabout terms.
And Sudanese have said it to me. Sudanese have said to me, I hate the SAF, but you know what? I hate the RSF more.
There is a lot of that going on. And I think that is, from my perspective, that's their win. That they have taken the Sudanese population to such a pain point that they are willing to go back to their abusive partner.
Yep.
That's where we're at. And essentially, the Sudanese public right now, you know, people think, oh, there are no humanitarian corridors, you know, there needs to be a ceasefire. There are humanitarian corridors. When one side is about to take a territory, they open a humanitarian corridor for the soldiers, and the soldiers march out, and then they turn on the civilian population. It happened in Jazeera, it happened in Al-Fashir, and essentially this war on civilians, the civil war doesn't really capture it. It's a war on civilians. And the SAF are the biggest and the most ultimate perpetrators of this. Yes, the RSF are doing it in very florid, you know, horrific, atrocious terms. But frankly, so is the SAF, just slightly more undercover. And even the United Nations fact-finding mission, it does actually state that both sides are responsible for atrocities, as responsible for war crimes, doesn't go so far as to say genocide yet. But essentially, the SAF, sitting in that de facto authority seat, sitting in New York, sitting in Geneva, is blocking all of the evidence gathering, is blocking the UN and other mechanisms from doing what they need to do. But speak to any Sudanese and they will tell you the pain that they have felt personally over 30 years at the hands of SAF and its political apparatus. So no, from my perspective, I'm not on the ground. I think the way that people need to get on the ground is really up to them. But what really surprises me is people outside of Sudan who say, why not? You know, just give it back to SAF. We've learned our lesson. This is a counter-revolutionary war. This is the point. The pain is the point. And capitulating now is really a disastrous
Okay,
decision.
let's see Kate's perspective on that one.
I mean, I agree absolutely with Eva, but would maybe even go further. I mean, most of my work is looking at the RSF atrocities, and that is mostly what we do. However, let us not ignore, exactly as Eva says, the mass atrocity crimes against civilians that the SAF are responsible for. We can see that as they establish and begin to consolidate their influence and political space over territory, they begin to essentially cleanse political opponents or those that they can project. So I actually think that the origins do deeply matter, because there is an origin here of a pathology of political power holding that is absolutely rooted in some of the most experienced ways of weaponizing identity-based mass violence to political advantage. I mean, to an extent, they've been doing it for decades, right? And so there's deep practice there. And so this is one of the things that I really worry in the absence of international discussion and understanding of what is happening in Sudan, that if only we can get a ceasefire, if only there can be an end to the war, things will be okay. No, if we don't set standards now about the value of civilian Sudanese life, that if we get to your imaginary situation...
But you're so idealistic.
But
I've
no,
lived
I'm
through this
not.
since 1986.
No, I'm not. Because
it's appalling. And I
if you
cannot
imagine your
see
reality,
that this kind of idealism is going to at least bring us to an end to the war and then start to rebuild. I totally get it, but the point I'm making is sitting here and talking, you know, in the diaspora and people like me talking about, you know, how ideally it should be a civilian government and so on. I agree with all of that. But what the hell are we going to do now?
But I don't think it's idealistic. I think it's necessary, because I think that if we don't even start talking about civilian life as having worth at these high levels, rather than this performative rhetoric that the international community has got stuck in, that is abandonment. But there also needs to be a very firm cost for those that violate it. And that's why we have been pushing from the beginning, have a track on civilian protection, so that whatever comes next, the international standards have been set. Make there be a higher cost for doing business in Abu Dhabi. Make there be a cost for when, you know, as Ros has set out, these litany of international actors are funneling and fueling this violence. We have made the cost of complicity and profit from atrocity crimes so low. Yeah. That's not idealistic. That is our collective
safety. That is very real. And that, I think, is a really good point, because I think the point about the British connection with the UAE and also with Saudi, but, you know, particularly on the sort of atrocity thing, and the UAE is absolutely critical. So, Rosalind, put your notes away. Remember, think. Let's say you are now the British ambassador to Khartoum, as you once were. What is the advice you would be giving the Foreign Office at this time?
Well, I think, I
put your microphone up.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. No, you have to put your...
Sorry.
Yeah.
I do actually agree with what Kate and Eva have said. I think it's very important to frame this conflict correctly, because if we don't do that, then you apply the wrong medicine, you diagnose the problem wrongly. And I think, you know, there's been a tendency, yes, as was said earlier, to portray it just as a humanitarian crisis. It's a political one. There's also been a tendency to downplay the role of the civilians and not to listen to their views, and, you know, to learn lessons from the transitional government period, the mistakes made both by the civilians but also the sabotage by the military and the Islamists and the previous regime. My own view is that, you know, the British government is doing quite a few things that are right in the background, supporting many of the civilian groups, as, you know, now supporting the emergency response rooms. I think it's important. There are two ways. I understand what you said, Lindsay, about it sounding idealistic, but it's essential to support and urge all the civic groups, whether they're grassroots, whether they're political actors who are committed to genuine democratic transition, to unite in the broadest possible civilian front, and on the basis of a minimum set of principles to end the war, to stop the bloodshed. And, you know, if there is a broad and representative enough group of them, the international community will have to take them more seriously. At the moment, I think, you know, there's still caution because civilians are divided. Well, civilians are divided in every country. But in addition to that, and that's something the Sudanese have to do for themselves, and stop sort of allowing divisions and personal rivalries and organisational issues to get in the way. But the second thing is then the international community and those who share democratic values need to get behind them and apply more pressure. Obviously, it's difficult to do it directly to the warring parties, although more sanctions could be used. But this is where perhaps we can come on to the mediation efforts, the Quad, because it's essential to try and put pressure on the...
Like I say, the Quad is Saudi Arabia, the UAE, America, and who else is it?
Egypt.
And Egypt.
Yes.
So this is a group of countries which are supposed to be putting pressure on the warring parties and negotiating some kind of ceasefire and eventual peace.
So the most promising mediation initiative at the moment is this Quad initiative, which was launched on the 12th of September last year. And the reason it has created a glimmer of hope, despite a number of massive problems that it faces, is that for the first time, Egypt, Saudi Arabia on the one hand and the UAE on the other were actually forced by the Americans to come together on a roadmap which would, first of all, aim to get a humanitarian truce. That doesn't end the war, but it to enable urgent humanitarian aid to get in, leading on, if possible, to a permanent ceasefire and then a transition leading on to a civilian government. But it also, crucially, they all put their name to the statement that none of the warring parties should control the transition, and that there needs to be an independent civilian government with broad legitimacy. Now,
Can I stop you there, because I want to ask Eva about that. We're going to come to questions in a few minutes, but let me just put that one to Eva. So, the role of the civilians. So, of course, Sudan had a civilian government after the revolution in 2019. Tell me where the civilians are and what role you think they could be playing. Because at the moment, as Rosalind said, they're pretty divided, aren't they? All the different political parties and political groups and so on.
Yes, certainly. I mean, one of the issues that we have is this interesting ask that we get in every, room, round table, wonderful policy dialogue of the past 3 years is this, the civilians are so divided. How on earth can we possibly begin to speak with them? And I sometimes have to say, are the civilians not divided in the UK? Are they not divided in the US? This is a normal thing that civilians have, the people, populations, not civilians, they're people. And the population can be divided along separate lines. The difficulty we have when the UK goes into an election and it dissolves and there's not a single parliamentarian, there has a sort of, the backup system kicks in and Whitehall takes care of things and the institutions run. In Sudan, the institutions, the civil servants, all of it are tied to the sort of political, the state and the political apparatus, and the army has been part of that. The RSF is, of course, brought into that through the transition. And so essentially you end up with civil society having to take care of all the things. Health and education had a budget of 1% combined in Sudan, historically, for 30 years. Does that sound like a government? Does that sound like provision? And I think what we've been trying to encourage all of the interlocutors that we've had over the past at least 3 years since war, but even before, is that if you are looking at where the power is, at where the potential is, look at where the provision is, and that's civil society, it is civilian groups, it is mutual aid. And mutual aid is not something that started 3 years ago. It is a historical, neighbor to neighbor, put the zir outside so anyone can drink water for free on the street. It is part of Sudanese culture. And the ERRs, the emergency response rooms, the reason they could kick in within 3 days as a response is because they were there during COVID, they were there as neighborhood committees, they were there as resistance committees, they were there as Nafir, they were there as Grifna, and this is just in my little lifetime and not the sort of historical aspect. So when people say, where are the civilians and the civilians are so divided, my question is, what have you done to engage the civilians? And I think if you were ambassador, I would be very, very grateful, but at the moment we have an ambassador and an envoy in one role, and I've never met him in 15 months of his role. That tells you something.
And of course, I totally get it when you talk about, of course, civilians are divided. But that role which civilians have traditionally played and so on, how do you turn that at this time into a political force that can have an impact on this situation?
So what we have to remember is that the civilians in 2019 were betrayed by the transition.
Totally.
Right? Anyone who's looked at the JPA, for example, which sort of...
Can you say what JPA is?
The Juba Peace Agreement, which emboldened and enshrined the military actors, but gave very little to anybody else and kind of, I suppose, gave them this kind of forever payday in Sudan's history. It's bewildering. It's a bewildering piece. But essentially, the civilians were sidelined even after they won something, and even then the army underwrote it and had machinations. So let's not have any airy-fairy ideas. But even at that point, those that actually raised the popular revolution were told to go home. The youth, the women, the marginalized were dismissed, and then you had a lot of civilians, technocrats brought in whose hands were tied, frankly, the entire time.
So now, how do you think that? Because there are extraordinary Sudanese, I suspect some of them are on the front row. We find extraordinary people, that's my experience. And yet I don't know how their voices can count in this, in any attempt to try and stop this horror.
Let's take the example of the British government. Last year, there was a conference for Sudan, as there is every year. Ros and I have had many a conversation, we've had many a conversation. The UK government had a real chance to not just include Sudanese, but to include Sudanese civilians and civil society. It did none of that. That conference was sort of, I suppose, advertised as a mediation-esque effort, not a pledging conference. And, you know, you think that is exactly the moment to bring in civilians and civil society. Not done. And then, of course, because, you know, things couldn't be agreed and it all kind of fell apart, it became a pledging bid. You know, run and pledge. It's successful. We've done something. We've raised, was it 800 million? I can't remember now. But essentially, even the UK government, which professes to this three-pronged strategy about humanitarian assistance, about protection of civilians, about a political process, cannot support the civilians meaningfully, boldly. Where is the diplomatic champion for the civilian democratic cause? The Quad has within it theocracies, you know, autocracies and dictators, oh my. And essentially those actors are just invited to the table. Where is the diplomatic champion for the civilians? And I think the UK could really play a role in that.
Okay, Rosalind, I'm going to open it to questions. I just want to say one thing, which is if you annoy a panel, they're always really good. We got 20 minutes for questions, and so I think, and then we're going to have a sort of very short discussion where we look at, you know, the way forward. So there's somebody with a roving mic. I would particularly like to hear from Sudanese, and I see you. Has anybody got a question? Don't be shy. Yes, lady in the front row. Can we bring? And it can be for, your question can be for anybody on the panel. And if you'd like to introduce yourself, that would be nice.
Thank you. My name is Visal. I'm doing the MSc in Global Mental Health at King's and the London School. And my question is, we were discussing about protection of civilians, but what about the protection of humanitarian aid workers?
Yes.
We know that the number of casualties have been increasing. There were systematic targeting to them. Who is taking care of them? What are the services provided to them? And who is keeping the track of the number of casualties? And who is gonna, who's accountable for these?
For them. That's such a good question. Do you want to take that one, Eva? The protection of humanitarian workers, because it is one of the absolute horrors of this conflict, is the extraordinary efforts of the Sudanese people and what has been visited on some of the most wonderful and extraordinary people I've ever met. So, yeah.
Thank you for the question. I think when it comes to protection, which is, I think, how the bulk
Kate
of,
has also been.
Yes, exactly. The bulk of our work and my work with Kate is, you know, the most dangerous thing to be in Sudan is a civilian, not a soldier, right? Civilian deaths outnumber soldier deaths. And actually, the more active you are, you know, if you're somebody who's in the neighborhood organizing, running a kitchen, getting medicine, food, that puts a target on your back. Not only when territory changes sides and you become labeled as a collaborator, but because you're literally doing the most profane thing of keeping people alive. Because when the SAF and the RSF are both playing the cheaper to kill people by famine than bullets, it means that if you go against that grain, you are putting a target on your back. Nobody is recognizing the effect or the effort of Sudanese civilians, be they health workers or teachers or, you know, faith leaders who are trying to keep communities together. Not only are they not funded, they're not recognized. And of course, there are lots of calls for respecting international humanitarian law and international human rights law and so on and so forth, but who's enforcing them? Nothing is being forced in Sudan. And I think the one thing I would add, other than the sort of war of atrocities that we have going, we have a war of impunity.
Yeah, so but can I ask Kate, with regard to that question, how do you protect them? Because we talk about protection, it's so important. But how
what
physically,
does that actually mean?
What does it mean and how can it be done?
I completely agree. I welcome that question. Whoever we're talking about protection, when it really comes down to it, you need a protective wedge between the people you're trying to protect and the guns. Mm-hmm. And there has been an absolute unwillingness to accept that. There have been very few moments in the last 3 years where we've got to the point where we can talk about what a protective force could mean, what UN protective responsibilities might mean. The Al-Fasher resolution, as I'm sure you're familiar with, sort of set out to the UN Secretary General, please write down what your recommendations for protecting civilians were. And frankly, he just dropped it.
He didn't do anything.
It was a devastating
but if we're talking about
but really what it means,
yes, sorry.
Let's be, you either mean peacekeeping.
Yeah.
And finally, actually, the conversation about peacekeeping has begun to shift in the last 6 months, because previously it was over, it would never happen, no one does peacekeeping. We're now talking about peacekeeping forces for Ukraine. We're talking about some kind of peacekeeping force for Gaza. Now, while there are a lot of caveats for a lot of those situations that are for different panels and deserve scrutiny, that actually is a shift. But it doesn't only have to be armed actors, right? What is the United Nations for? Getting observers in there, getting journalists when you
we try.
You do. And that matters enormously. So whether it's eyes and ears, whether it's spotlight, whether it's protective forces, that's the conversation that we need to be having. And we need to be massively upping the ante on our elected officials and our elected politicians in this country and elsewhere. If I may, I just want to give one reason why this is very important. And we are in London, and so that's why I say it. Not because London is the most responsible or important, but all of my activity is annoying our wonderful Foreign Office. In the autumn, a report came out from our independent commission on aid spend and how it had been spent in the last year regarding Sudan. And so it came out in November last year, so it was about the previous year. And it had a section about how the UK had approached exactly that question, protecting civilian protection, which includes humanitarian aid workers, it includes the prevention of sexual violence in conflict, these enormously significant and important protection issues. And it found that an options paper had been developed by the Foreign Office on policy positions that our government could take to protect civilians. And it found that our Foreign Office took, and I quote, the least ambitious option. And so if there's one thing that you can do is you can write to our Foreign Secretary or your Member of Parliament and say, why was that? And how are you ensuring that that mistake does not happen again?
Our government took the least ambitious option. Shocked. Right, who else has a question? I can see some at the back. Yes, there's a gentleman here, I think. Gentleman there in the pale blue shirt. I think it's pale blue. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mr. Mohammed. I'm a retired surgeon. It's just depressing that we've been talking a lot, and the problem in Sudan is just getting worse by the day. Most probably we're doing something wrong. We're talking a lot about the Quad, and I'm just asking myself, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, they're all fueling the war.
Yes.
How come they're actually part of the solution? And the US, I don't trust anything coming from US, from this.
But surely the point, I mean, it's a terribly good point, but surely you have to deal with the people who are causing or fueling the situation, otherwise they just carry on doing it. You can't ignore them, can you?
Yeah, I know. I agree, but the problem is, you're talking to people with might be two faces.
Oh, yes.
They
At
tell you
least
something
two faces,
and
if not more.
else, and they have their own agenda. They don't have the prosperity and of Sudan and stopping the war in their mind. They're looking after their own interests.
Yeah, absolutely. Rosalind, from your diplomatic experience, because this is a very apt point, that these people are acting in what they regard as their own interests, certainly not in the interest of the Sudanese people. As a diplomat or a former diplomat, how do you deal with that in this kind of negotiation?
Well, I mean,
first of all, you hold your microphone, or else nobody can hear you.
Sorry, I keep forgetting.
Yeah.
I mean, you make a point that I've heard from a number of people. Sort of, how can you have the UAE in the mediation group? I suppose people on the other side might say, how can you have Egypt in the group? But as Lindsay's just said, I mean, the whole point, I think, is that the US probably is the only country, because it's got close relations with all these three Arab countries, that could, if it so chose, actually, put pressure on them to stop, to scale back or stop providing military or other support. And you have to talk to the countries that are most actively involved if you're going to influence the situation. So just talking to one group of them and not the other is not really going to solve things. And in a way, if they're both, each side is looking at what the other is doing, you want to sort of have both of them in the picture and to try to find a solution that they can all buy into. But I mean, at the moment, I think some people thought when President Trump sort of said, okay, I'll see what I can do, when Mohammed bin Salman raised it, that looking at it from a sort of possibly a positive way, maybe that would energize and give extra backing to his envoy, Massad Boulos. But I mean, so far, we haven't seen any, I think, visible sign that Trump has actually stepped in. And of course, in the light of recent developments, some people would say, well, do we want him to anyway? But there is
still powerful.
But if I may say so, I mean, there is a regional dimension that, like it or not, has to be tackled. And probably a group like the Quad is might be the best way of trying to do that in the absence of anything else. But then, there's also what follows on, which is trying to get some sort of political settlement or solution. And there, I have a very strong feeling the Americans, even if they can get a humanitarian truce and a ceasefire, would then at that point say, we're not interested in staying in this for the long term, over to the Europeans. And so that actually might be the opportunity for the UK and some of its European partners to really step up and play a more leading role.
Let me ask Ava, you were nodding there.
Yes, I was going to say that, it absolutely makes sense that for a track one mediation, you need to talk to those who are, financing, fueling, and the belligerents themselves. And the idea is to bring the belligerents in anyway, but by no means should it be the only show in town. That's the problem here. We don't have a track two. We don't have any engagement.
Explain what track two is.
So a sort of a complementary track that can actually feed into the track one mediation and supported by getting a wider constituency and consensus of actors, international experts, mediators. This is where the UN could really play a role. And certainly what we call the like-minded states. So, those that seem to be, the liberal democracies of the West and friends that might be able to open up that path, bring in the civilians, platform the civilians, and civil society as well, to talk very honestly and openly about what's happening on the ground and what the future should look like, and not leave it all to the armed men and their friends.
And I would add one more thing. I'm abusing my position as the chair. I would add one more thing. No, I just think that the British underestimate the influence they have on the UAE and Saudi Arabia. The British government has a huge military relationship with both of those countries. And when you talk to the Brits particularly about the UAE, they're mealy-mouthed because they think they've got bigger fish to fry. Well, Sudan is the biggest fish as far as some of us are concerned.
I'd say, Lindsay, just to come in, I think the main priority for the UK and for the US is, yes, there's this US-UAE defense pact that they signed in 2024, but really it's a business relationship. And that's what we need to tackle. The UK, US, and other countries with these Quad actors, particularly the UAE and also Saudi Arabia, we really need to be thinking what we do from the business side of things.
Yeah, so business, so it becomes for businesses, it becomes shameful to deal with them, something like that.
Well, perhaps, I don't know. I'm not a business sector person. I'm a physician and, all sorts of other sort of woolly things to the business sector. But essentially, the question is, where does CSR, ESG, where does all of that come into it? But really, it's about making the price of dealing with the UAE hard enough, making that a stain, making it difficult, making it uncomfortable. And really, the UK government is going to be part of that. When you are continuing to allow, defense contracts to go out to the UAE, and machinery and all the rest of it to be sold, that then ends up on the battlefield in Darfur, British vehicles and so on. It's shameful.
Yeah, I think that's and we're going to come in a minute when we finish with the questions. We're going to, talk about ways forward and so on. And I think that's a very key point, Ava. Let's take a couple more questions. I shall stop being mean to the people at the back. Go on, let's give it to that person. You're near the back.
Hi, Daniela Peled from the...
hello, Danielle.
Hello, from the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. The panel has made it very clear that this is a sort of war of horrible superlatives. It's the biggest and it's the worst, and so on and so forth. But I think also what's obvious is in every discussion about Sudan is the frustration at the lack of global interest or media attention. And I wonder, especially if you're talking about ways forward after this, what, if you could dig down a little deeper into what the issues are, as hard as many of us do strive to highlight this, is it because the narrative is less simple of a good guy and a bad guy? Is it a geographical thing? What are your insights into that?
That's very good. And I also have something to say on this. But go on. Who wants to take that? Why do you think Sudan is getting less diplomatic, media, and other attention than it deserves? It should. Rosalind, I can see you with your microphone up and looking at your notes again. I wish you'd put your notes away.
Well, maybe I can have a stab at that. I mean, obviously there are the obvious points about other major global crises that have been taking up the bandwidth, and unfortunately, as Lindsay said, they're coming thick and fast at sort of more or less every day at the moment. There's the humanitarian imperative, which one would have thought would have been sufficient to put the Sudan war right at the top of the priorities. But we don't know, of course, one of the problems is we don't know what the casualty figures are. I mean, in the case of Gaza, Hamas have said 70,000, I think, whether that's true or not. In the case of Sudan, I mean, it's hundreds of thousands. And of course, with the spread of famine, it could become more and more. So it's difficult, figures that are in the media, 150,000, have absolutely no basis. But I mean, one can be sure that it's probably much more than that. Apart from the humanitarian catastrophe, I mean, reasons why the international media should also look at it is that it's a war that is also destabilising the much wider region.
I think we know why everybody should be looking at it. I think the question is, why has so little diplomatic attention been expended on Sudan compared to, for example, Ukraine or Gaza?
Well, I think that comes back to perhaps prioritisation, that it's not perhaps perceived from Western capitals. It's not going to start World War III. Yeah. It doesn't have the same domestic lobby groups that perhaps Israel-Palestine have got. It's seen as an African crisis, which is not met for many people. They don't understand the background. As we've said, I think people look at the symptoms, the humanitarian catastrophe, but the historical, political, economic drivers of the crisis are not understood. So, as you say, there seem to be no good guys because people only think about the RSF or SAF, and the civilian voice is not really heard sufficiently to sort of say, well, actually, there are a large group of Sudanese civilians who want to stop this war, and you need to get behind them.
Can I play devil's advocate?
Yes,
I mean, I don't know what it's devil advocate when you actually agree with everything that's been said, but then you're going to try a different position anyway, because it is deeply frustrating whether you're trying to get media coverage or diplomatic engagement on Sudan. It is devastating, and there's no pushback on that. I just want to say though that let's think about the coverage and diplomatic attention and spotlight on Gaza. It is extraordinary. I've never known anything like it. And yet it did not help or save or prevent the utter destruction of Gaza and its people. And it has not led to a mitigation of the destruction and displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank. And so
thank you for telling me that my whole life has been pointless. You go on.
Well, I try to prevent atrocity crimes, so I don't think I'm doing very well either. But my flip side and positive side, so let me build you back up, is that actually in the UK on Sudan, I'm not talking about the global piece. I'm not talking about how it's felt on the ground in Sudan. But as an advocate and political strategist in London, actually, it does not take an awful lot of movement on Sudan for the Foreign Office to move a little bit, to take those calls. Now, we can have perhaps conversations after the cameras go down on what we might think about, where those conversations go. There have been moments where we have put in asks to ministers in the last 3 years. We have been met within 48 hours, and then we have helped advocate and push towards securing the Al-Fasher resolution. After the fall of Al-Fasher, now, it should never have taken the fall and the biggest single atrocity since the 1990s to trigger this. But there was, in fact, not an awful lot of coverage, but there was some. Yes. And there was moments of spotlight in both the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and our committee stepped up, and many in this room stepped up. And actually what that meant is, I think, a significant set out by Yvette Cooper of a new approach to a UK policy on Sudan. Now, we've seen this before, and so let's see if it can be sustained, and that is for us to maintain that sustained engagement. But unlike on Gaza, where the entire movement and population every single Friday have been on the streets saying not in our name, and we have not seen that kind of change come fast enough. So actually, proportionately, I just play slightly devil's advocate that the UK government listens when you get that pushback. So don't think it doesn't register. They hear it. It's the sustained piece on both sides that is the challenge.
Okay,
Lindsay, if I may, just I think Sudan matters by proxy. It doesn't matter in and of itself. The average person who's fighting for Gaza is worried about the Palestinian child. They're worried about the Palestinian mother, about the Palestinian doctor, and so on and so forth, names that have become, like family members to us, whether in captivity or whether because they've been killed. I don't know that the average, even protester for Sudan, could do that on Sudan.
But let me just say, so from a journalist point of view, let me just tell you something very practical. Gaza is tiny. It's full of journalists. Some of the best camera operators I've ever met are Gazans. We get pictures every single day from the agencies, Reuters, AFP, Associated Press. We, Channel 4 News, have had our own people there because it's minute. It's the size of this room, okay? And it's very congested. Something happens and it's in the next house. It's in that sense it's easy. In another sense, it's really difficult because we have lost so many of our colleagues in Gaza. The people who work for us, for Western media, and also for Arab media, that the level of killing against Palestinian journalists is horrendous, but they have continued to do their work. Sudan is a huge place. It's much more difficult for Sudanese to, something happens over there, it takes you 4 days to get there, and you probably get pulled off the bus and attacked by armed men on your way there. It's extremely dangerous and difficult, and you don't have the same number of Sudanese journalists working in a small space. From the point of view of a foreign journalist, people say, oh, Lindsay, great, she goes to Sudan. I don't go that often. I've been once last year, and I went once the year before. And we try and keep the story going when we can. It's bloody difficult because it's television, and we get so few pictures out. And it's been extremely difficult to get there. It takes me nearly a week to get to Khartoum. Right? And it takes me nearly a week to get back. And then, I try and do a week's reporting when I'm there. So that's 3 weeks for 1 week's reporting. In Ukraine or in Israel or whatever, it's much, much easier. It's much more expensive. It's extremely dangerous. It's hard to get other people to go. It's very hard physically. It's quite hard as well as dangerous. Nowhere to stay. All of this kind of stuff. All of these things play in. Now, you can argue that all journalists should be better people. We should be better human beings. And I would agree with you. But, sometimes we find it hard.
If I may, Lindsay, I think the other difference is that Palestinians have been ready for this for 80 years.
Yes.
Sudanese have not.
Yes.
And that's a very different relationship to the rest of the world. It's a different relationship to the British public because Britain has a relationship with that
and Britain
region.
is complicit or is regarded as complicit. And that is also a big thing in terms of journalism, is the role that our government plays. Listen, it's 7:25, and I've talked too much. They're never going to invite me back, are they? What does it say here? This bit's a bit like being in church, where they ask you to kind of shake the hand of the person next to you, and it's always unbelievably embarrassing. But anyway, what I'm supposed to do, pose a question to the room to kickstart conversations, which they hope they'll continue over drinks. The drinks bit I can definitely go for. So you're supposed to turn to your neighbour. Oh dear, is this going to work? Anyway, and talk about what's the one thing you've heard tonight that you're curious about, want clarified or challenged, or an insight you could bring? Or is there a skill, platform, resource that you could potentially offer, creatively or whatever, or funding? Do you know someone, an editor, don't come to me, investor, policymaker, artist, influencer, who should be paying attention to Sudan right now, or can influence things? So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to think about what useful things you can do for Sudan, or what you've heard tonight which you think is important or meaningful. Then I'm going to shut you all up. then we're going to stop, and then those of us who drink are going to have a drink. Start now.
What are we going to do about Sudan? What are we going to do about Sudan? We need a holiday. I was very weak. No.
No, they're all talking about
provocation is interesting. It's like a question time.
No, not from whatever.
Yeah. Unpredictability just for us.
They don't trust me. And you don't know. I will actually measure. I will try and see if I can. I will.
I wrote just for a couple of weeks, I think. Yeah, for a few months at least. She put up a research project twice. For one thing, the remote places where you're based, you're on a plane every week. I know, my goodness. And my other half is always saying,
I'm now, you have responded brilliantly to the call. Oh, they won't shut up now. Ladies and gentlemen, let me finish this session. I hope that you're having brilliant and creative ideas on what to do about Sudan, and I have every faith that you are. I just want to wrap up by thanking the panel, thanking Crisis Action, and to reiterate how much some of us care about Sudan, how much it matters, about the women who've been raped and the children who are hungry, about the people who deserve so much more from their own leaders and from the international community. How important it is in our country, and people will be here from other countries as well, to put pressure on our leaders to do more to bring this war to an end. To business people who are here, to look at where you are investing and have a little think about the UAE, maybe about Saudi Arabia, Egypt too, but have a little think about it. To think about how we can shame those who think that what they're doing is good and right, but it ends up in the killing of people in Sudan. It ends up in the rape of women in Sudan, and how we shouldn't shy away from that. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Crisis Action. I think those of us who drink need a drink. Thank you to the panel.